Very impressed. We have a very obedient audience. That's not always the case. We're right on time at 10:10. Outstanding. Except for Admiral Kelly. Where's Admiral Kelly, John? He's UA, right? Yeah. So we're going to move to a panel, and Dr. Ed Barrett, who's the Director of Strategy and Research here at the Center, is going to lead that, and he's going to kick it off. But when I have this opportunity, I've just got to thank Ed publicly, because each year he does an incredible job of pulling together the agenda, the speakers, figuring out how it's all going to fit. And he has been an incredible addition to the Stockdale Center. So Ed, I personally appreciate all you do, and I'm going to turn it over to you. Okay. Even though, are you missing two panelists? Or
Jessica's here.
Okay.
We are missing Marcus.
Okay.
So we have a search party.
All right.
Okay.
So I can just keep talking.
Yeah.
Kill the penalty.
Yeah. So we'll find him eventually. Okay. So this is the first panel, and this and the next one are comprised of the people who were in the seminar, the research seminar this year. We read through the entire Reichberg, Sissa, and what's the other author's name? Begley? Yeah, anthology, and that was our project this year. And we read additional commentaries too, but that was our main source book, and we had an excellent time, excellent discussions throughout the year on all those authors and those concepts. And so we just decided to have the participants give about a 10-minute presentation on a topic encountered during the year that really struck them as important and requiring emphasis here at the conference. So I'll be the chair. I'll give a talk at the end on the principle of double effect. The first speaker is David Luban, and he's the University Professor of Law and Philosophy at Georgetown University Law Center, and he's currently the class of 1984 Distinguished Visitor in ethics at the Stockdale Center. And then the next speaker, a fellow this year, Dr. Jessica Wolfendale, and she's Associate Professor of Philosophy at West Virginia University. And she's the author of Torture and the Military Profession, and is co-editor of New Wars and New Soldiers, Military Ethics in the Contemporary World, Ashgate 2011. And this is from the program that you have. And then I'll go. If Dr. Marcus Hadel is not here. If he's here, he will go next. And he's Assistant Professor of Philosophy here at the Naval Academy, has a bachelor's in physics from Notre Dame, and he spent some time as an Air Force officer as Assistant Professor of Philosophy at the Air Force Academy. So with that, I will turn it over to David, and David is going to speak on preventive war.
Hi. It's really nice to be here and to see a lot of familiar faces from last year's McCain conference, so old friends and hopefully new. And I want to start with my own thank you. This is the end of my second year as the class of '84 visitor at the Stockdale Center, and I really want to first thank Ed for just totally inspiring leadership of the research seminar, and also for introducing us to the mysteries of the IPA at Harry Brown's. And secondly, to Art for running a happy ship on the second floor of Luce Hall. So these have been great, a couple of great years with you guys, and I want to thank you, take this occasion to thank you. Now, the place that I'm going to start is backhandedly with a defense of the new order that Jim Johnson was criticizing in his talk. And I want to start at the end of World War II, when the statesmen of the world are looking around at 1.5 ruined continents and 70 million dead people, and trying to figure out how can we, in a system of sovereign states, avoid having it happen again. And one of the solutions that they came up with, along with the founding of the United Nations, was to pare down the notion of just cause of war dramatically, to eliminate first use of force. So, of course, that's an idea that had already appeared and failed in the Kellogg-Briand Pact. But they wanted to keep the idea and strengthen it. And the intuition behind it is simple. If nobody goes first, nobody goes at all. But of course, they also understand that statesmen break rules. And what happens if somebody goes first? Well, there is still, they insist, the inherent right of self-defense. But that means that the notion of just cause has been, for entirely practical reasons, which they state in the preamble of the Charter as avoiding the untold sorrow of war which has twice devastated the world, for entirely practical reasons been pared down to self-defense. Now, that concept raises the question that discussions about preventive war have revolved around since. And what I'm going to argue today is they also revolved around them before. Does the idea of no going first, no first use of force, really mean that you have to wait for an enemy who is planning an attack to strike first? Do you actually have to wait until the gun is out of the holster before you draw? And this is something that I think is still contested, but I think that the historical view is you don't have to do that, that there are certain circumstances in which preemptive force, what we now call anticipatory self-defense, but let me just say preemptive force is justified. And a lot of the debate around this, we've discovered this year, was formulated by thinkers in the 17th through 19th centuries. And one of the ideas behind the use of preemptive force comes from Grotius, who is the great 17th century jurist, natural law proponent of a certain sort and founder of modern international law, who says that preempting an enemy attack is justified, but only if the attack is, in his words, immediate and imminent in time. Now, that's one of the criteria that I want to discuss today, is immediate and imminent in time. That's an idea that then gets echoed in the 19th century by our own Daniel Webster in the wake of the Caroline incident, which was a border incident in Canada and New York State, when Webster also insists in a letter to the British, who had used preemptive force on a U.S. vessel, that it has to be facing a threat that is immediate and of overwhelming necessity to repel. So the criterion is immediacy. That raises a different question, though. What about less immediate threats? What about preventive war, anticipatory self-defense? Not when you have immediacy and imminence of that sort, but when the threat is looming and distant and on the horizon. Now, here the one view is that you can always exercise an inherent right of preventive self-defense. And I'll draw a distinction. Preemptive I'll reserve only for the immediate and imminent kind. Preventive is longer time horizon, a distant threat. So Alberico Gentili, who, notwithstanding the Italian name, was a professor at Oxford, a professor of canon law and civil law, was an unabashed proponent of preventive use of force. He says, we ought not wait for violence to be offered us. If it is safer to meet it halfway. No one ought to expose himself to danger. No one ought to wait to be struck unless he's a fool. And then he adds, a defense is just which anticipates dangers that are probable and possible. Okay. Now notice that's a big difference. Possible, wow, that means you can always use preventive force. But probable seems to narrow it a bit more, and that takes us to the second, I think, historical line of thinking about this. The first ties it to time, to imminence. The second ties it to probability and to risk management. So here we have a philosopher and thinker, great in stature, funny in name, Pufendorf, He grants that Grotius's restriction to immanence has some plausibility, though a rather slight one. He thinks, along with Gentili, that fear alone can be a just cause, but only if we, and here I'll quote again, determine with a morally evident certitude that there is an intention to hurt us, a morally evident certitude. Now we're not talking time and immanence. It's going to happen next week. It's going to happen tomorrow. Now we're talking about probability and risk management. So for Pufendorf, the test isn't overwhelming immanence in time, but overwhelming probability. And now I want to throw in a third conceptualization, which along with time and risk brings in consequence. So, for those of you who know the theory of utility, we talk about the expected value of an outcome, not just in terms of its probability, but its probability multiplied by the magnitude of the consequence. That's the expected value. Emmerich Vattel, who was a great jurist, Swiss jurist of the 18th century, writes this: one is justified in forestalling a danger in direct ratio to the degree of the probability attending to it. So far he's on Pufendorf's page. Look at probability, and to the seriousness of the evil with which it is threatened. Now we're talking about the magnitude of the bad consequence. Now, Vattel turned out to be tremendously influential among the American constitutional framers and the colonial Americans. He was the go-to guy for international law. So this is an influential view. Now, one of the things that struck me about Vattel's view is how surprisingly close it is to the Bush administration's national security strategy in 2002 and 2005. And I'll read the relevant paragraph from that strategy. The greater the threat, the greater is the risk of inaction, and the more compelling the case for taking anticipatory action to defend ourselves, even if uncertainty remains as to the time and place of the enemy's attack, and therefore the United States must act against such emerging threats before they're fully formed. Now, the greater the threat, the greater is the risk of inaction, is bringing in, it seems to me, expected value thinking again. If it's a huge threat with enormous bad consequences, then the immanence, you don't have to wait for immanence, and the probability threshold can be lowered. And one manifestation of this is Vice President Cheney's famous 1% doctrine. If there's even a 1% chance of Al-Qaeda getting a nuclear weapon, we have to treat it as though it were 100%. And of course, treating it as though it were 100% means that we can act against it at any time. Okay, now, the context in which the early moderns talked about preventive use of force, they weren't thinking about super weapons. What they were thinking about was balance of power politics. So if the enemy is threatening to get too strong, you can launch war against them to stop them before they get too strong. In the current context, that might be a motivation, for example, for Saudi Arabia to attack Iran preventively, or the other way around, because both of them are playing a balance of power game. That, notice, is very different than Israel's potential motivation for attacking Iran, which is much closer to the 1% doctrine. A single strike is an existential threat. And in a situation like that, then we have to be able to preempt, even with rather low probability. But balance of power turns out to be something that I think the historical experience shows licenses way too many wars. That is, taking us back to the beginning of my talk, the situation that the statesmen who confronted the end of World War II saw. Balance of power politics had led to the long war and the destruction of a continent and a half. Now, I'm quite attracted to the Vattel and Bush national security statement conception of preventive war as having to do with expected value, having to do with probability and magnitude. But I'd like to give a much more restricted version of it and present my own view of what preventive war should be. First of all, an unrestricted permission to launch preventive war is so broad that it amounts to a generalized permission for military rivals to go to war virtually at will against each other. So it just broadens the category of permissible wars enormously. Furthermore, it broadens the category to include situations in which what I'm going to call the burdens of judgment and the infirmities of judgment play an inevitable role. Now, what I mean by the burdens of judgment, which is a term that I take from the philosopher John Rawls, it's the inevitability that different people's judgment will differ. Different people's risk assessments will differ. And that means that you might launch a preventive war with too little, based on mistaken judgment. And I think if you think back to the United States political debate in 2002 about the preventive war justification for Iraq, you'll see what I mean. Well, everybody here remembers the superheated atmosphere, the fear, the endless uncertainties about intelligence, the second guessing and third guessing and fourth guessing of Saddam Hussein's intentions, the praising of Hans Blix, the trashing of Hans Blix, then you see the burdens of judgment operating. Now, to grant lawful permission to decision-making under those kinds of burdens is very dangerous. Now, furthermore, if one state's justified in launching a preventive war against another, that very fact makes it an emerging threat to the target state, and therefore it justifies the target state in launching a preventive war against it, so that you create dyads, you create pairs of mutual threats, and the notion of just cause threatens to balloon. Okay, so that would justify first strikes against each other by both India and Pakistan, both North Korea and Japan, both Ethiopia and Eritrea, both Congo and Rwanda, both Israel and Iran. And now we're back to the untold sorrows of war. So I think that in the end we ought to cabin the notion of preventive war. I still think that the right criteria are expected value, immanence, and the magnitude of the threat. But the magnitude of the threat, I think, first of all, the condition should be, it has to be truly existential. Okay, we use the word existential when we just mean this would be really an awful thing to happen, but I think existential means existential. It means that the very existence of the political community is at stake if you allow even a single strike. Second, the proxies for high probability are that the adversary has not only a very militaristic ideology, but also a track record of using force in an aggressive way, and credible intelligence. The leaders actually have plans to use the weapons, weapons of mass destruction, say, against the state that's launching the preventive attack. And of course, I'm leaving, this is all on the level of just cause. I'm leaving aside the other conditions of just war. Now, I'd like to close by going back to the 1% doctrine, which I think is very problematic. The problem with the 1% doctrine is it would mean that if the magnitude of the danger is huge, say an adversary getting a few H-bombs or a batch of some kind of supervirus, we could use force preventively even if there's a near zero chance that they'll succeed, or a near zero chance that they actually mean to do us any harm. But that would license preventive war against everybody, because after all, there is a non-zero chance that the British are going to launch their nuclear arsenal against us. It's non-zero. So under something like the 1% doctrine, preventive war would be justified. So that's why I think that it's so important that there actually be a track record and a credible threat and not simply a mathematical probability that something is going to happen, because otherwise we end up licensing war everywhere all the time, and we are in exactly the situation that the framers of the UN Charter were trying to protect us against. So that's it.
Yeah, you take 12, maximum 15.
Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to echo Professor Luban's comments and thank Colonel Athens and Ed Barrett for having me as a Stockdale Fellow in the last year. It's been a fantastic experience, it's been a lot of fun, and very thought-provoking as well. So what I'm going to talk about today is right intention, and I did time myself last night and I got it down to 12 minutes, but that was talking at a rate of knots, so we'll see how that works today. What I want to do here is basically talk a little bit about some of the historical views of right intention, discuss a couple of contemporary views of right intention before concluding with some very preliminary thoughts of my own about whether and if right intention still has a role to play in just war thinking. So I'll talk briefly about the historical views. I'm just going to focus on Augustine and Aquinas due to lack of time. I should say at the moment, well, in today's just war thinking, right intention, when it is discussed, and it's not discussed very frequently or in much depth, typically, it's usually described as being a jus ad bellum criterion, requiring, for example, that leaders must incorporate just cause into their intention or motivation to go into war. But historically, it actually was considered a criterion that applied both in bello and ad bellum, although as Professor Johnson pointed out, that distinction wasn't actually made in very early writings on just war theory, the in bello ad bellum distinction. So Augustine, for example, in his works on just war theory, talks both about the leader or the prince's intentions, but also about the kind of mental states that soldiers themselves should cultivate and should also avoid in the conduct of war. So he says, and here's a quote, the passion for inflicting harm, the cruel thirst for vengeance, an implacable and relentless spirit, the fever of revolt, the lust of power, and such like things are rightly condemned in war. And that is clearly intended to apply to the individuals fighting the war, not just to the leader, although it would apply to the leader as well. So for Augustine, the only way to really reconcile Christian principles with participation in war is through having the right intention. So it's a very important idea for Augustine. So he says, for a Christian city, wars will be waged with the benevolent purpose that better provision might be made for the defeated to live harmoniously together in justice and godliness. And another quote, war is waged in order to obtain peace. And finally, a final quote, let necessity slay the warring foe, not your will. Which I think what he means there, it's a rather lovely phrase I thought, is that when you are killing in war, it can't be your intention to kill. Your intention is to carry out your order to defend your city. And that is what necessity refers to there. If it's your will to kill, then you have the wrong intention, and then you're committing a sin. Aquinas, centuries later, has a similar idea about right intention. So he, like Augustine, says, those waging war must intend the advancement of good or the avoidance of evil. They justly aim at peace, and so they are not opposed to peace. He also seems to intend right intention to apply both to soldiers and to leaders, because he actually quotes Augustine's earlier phrase about the passions that we condemn in war. And for Aquinas, like Augustine, you might have just cause, you might have rightful authority, but if your intention is wrong, that will render the entire war unjust. So he says, a war that has just cause and so forth will may be rendered, quote, illicit through a vile intention. So what I think is going on for Augustine and Aquinas is you have to remember what they're trying to do here is reconcile Christianity with waging war. So one of the roles that right intention plays in those historical documents that historical views that I've very briefly described is trying to say, well, how can we fight a war without committing mortal sins? How can I, as a soldier, kill other people in war, which is forbidden in the Bible, but still be a good person, still go to heaven? And likewise, how can a leader order such destruction that war causes and still be a Christian? So that's, in a sense, what the purpose of right intention is doing. So that here's how you can be a good Christian, be a good Christian prince, but still order war and fight in a war. I think Aquinas, though, does suggest a possibly different purpose that right intention might serve. So you might think that his statement about why we condemn the evils of lust and so forth is also because of sort of quasi-utilitarian reasons. So we might think that one of the reasons that we want to condemn these terrible desires and emotions is that those emotions contribute and enhance the destruction and evil that occurs in war. So that's just another way of thinking about right intention that I'm going to come back to, is whether one of the reasons we might think right intention is important is as a means for minimizing the destruction that war causes by cultivating particular kinds of mental states or emotions that could at least minimize the violence in war. So I'll return to that idea a bit later. Okay, so now I'm going to talk briefly about sort of two contemporary views of right intention, although it does, as a criterion in just war theory, tend to be fairly neglected in most discussions on this topic. So first of all, there's what I'm going to call the minimalist view of right intention, which I think is basically the view held by a lot of just war theorists. And essentially the idea is that right intention is met, and it's an ad bellum criterion. So people who hold this view tend not to see it as applying to in bello. And the idea is that, well, right intention is met so long as the war is fought primarily, whether it has to be solely for the purpose of the just cause is a sort of slightly debated issue, but at least has to be primarily for the purposes of achieving the just cause of war. One rationale for including right intention, understood in that sense, is that one concern might be if a prince, even if they have just cause, if they say, hey, I've got a just cause for war, so I'm going to take this opportunity to take over those trading routes or inflict punishment or carry out any other kind of aim, then the war aims and war strategies are likely to exceed what is permitted by just cause. So that's one of the rationales for including right intention, understood in that minimalist way. It restricts the war aims that are likely to be put in place by restricting the aim of the war to achieving just cause. Uwe Steinhoff, though, in a fairly recent paper, actually is one of the few people who says that right intention should also apply as an in bello criterion. He argues that, for a fairly minimalist understanding of right intention as an in bello criterion, he says that soldiers should, quote, know and respect the justified conditions of their own participation in war. So what he's suggesting, is, if I understand him correctly, is he thinks that it's not that you need a specific intention. So he thinks, in fact, the phrase right intention is actually a bit misleading in that sense. It's not that you need an intention, but you just need to recognise and respect or see as binding on you the conditions that make it permissible for you to fight. So he actually thinks, for example, that, unlike Augustine, he thinks it's fine if soldiers are filled with hatred and desires for revenge, so long as they don't act on them, right? So having those feelings for Steinhoff doesn't violate right intention, so long as soldiers are kind of essentially respecting the rules of war. Okay, a more substantive view of right intention would be a much more kind of broadly virtue-based or character-based conception of what right intention would require. So Chris Eberle, I'm not sure if he's here today, he's speaking tomorrow, has defended a version of right intention in, I think, an unpublished work. We read a chapter of it last week. So I'm going to use this as an example of what I'm talking about when I mean substantive conception. So for Eberle, right intention requires not only the minimalist idea that just cause has to be the motivating reason for going to war, but he also thinks that both soldiers and leaders, so again, for him it's an in bello and an ad bellum criterion, should actually cultivate certain kinds of other mental states towards the enemy. So they should cultivate respect for the enemy. They should, again, avoid emotions such as hatred or disgust or desire for vengeance. And for Eberle, the reason why this is required in war is because of the enemy's moral status as human beings. So in Eberle's view, human beings are owed respect, and that actually entails owing them in some ways certain ways of thinking about them. Right? There are ways of thinking about other people that will violate the respect that we owe to them in Eberle's view. So the reason why in Eberle's view soldiers should reject emotions like hatred is not because of utilitarian concerns that this will lead them to commit war crimes, but just because such hatred is incompatible with the respect due to other human beings, even ones we're fighting against. And it also entails cultivating appropriate emotions. So not just rejecting certain emotions, but also cultivating, I guess, positive emotions in some cases, but also emotions such as guilt or regret if one is involved in unjustified killing in war. So to quote, he says, "The right intention requirement not only forbids but also requires certain emotional states. It forbids those who wage war to hate enemy combatants. It mandates that those who wrongfully kill in war experience guilt over killing the innocent." Okay, so I'm not going to defend or say much more about Eberle's view. I just was offering it as an example of what I'm calling kind of substantive right intention view. Okay, so I'm going to conclude with sort of my preliminary thoughts on right intention. First of all, I think when assessing whether right intention plays a role or should play a role in just war thinking, I think it needs to be assessed against, what we think just war theory is doing, or what its primary function should be, particularly in relation to how just war theory is encoded or plays out in the international laws of armed conflict. So my suggestion is that, I personally think one of the primary functions of just war theory, again, particularly as encoded in the laws of armed conflict, is to minimise the human rights violations that occur in war, as well as minimising the destruction of the basic conditions of human life. So that is one way of explaining, for example, why it's forbidden to destroy monuments of cultural significance, religious sites, and so forth. Is that the role of just war theory in international law is to just attempt to minimise the destruction that war causes, right? So I see that as really as providing a kind of moral flaw, which is, I think, borrowing a phrase from someone, but I can't remember who. I think possibly Henry Shue used that phrase in relation to the role of human rights. But that's the basic idea. Just war theory is saying war is a terrible process. We just want to try and minimise the destruction that happens in war as much as we can. So given that sort of, again, I guess it's a fairly minimalist understanding of just war theory, does right intention matter, or does it play a role in that? Now, certainly, of course, it's better if soldiers and leaders have morally appropriate emotions, treat the enemy, or view the enemy with respect, feel guilt about wrongful killing. I think all those things are extremely important for our evaluation of individual character. I think they're also important for soldiers and leaders' psychological well-being. So I'm not at all intending to dismiss the importance of those things for those issues, but I don't think that is the best way of thinking about right intention as a requirement of just war theory, okay? Essentially, I think it's way more important that soldiers behave correctly than that they feel correctly. Now, if making them feel correctly did in fact make them behave correctly, then of course that would be a reason in favour of a more substantive account according to my view. But I'm actually a bit sceptical of that for a number of reasons. So firstly, I think requiring a substantive RI is in a sense impractical given limitations imposed by the nature of military training and culture. Military training and culture doesn't have, or there aren't the time and resources within military training and culture to cultivate successfully and consistently the kind of emotions and virtues and traits that a substantive conception of right intention wants. Particularly the kind of emotion and traits and virtues that would stand up to the extreme situational pressures of combat. So my first reason is just to say, look, this is great as an ideal. I think it's great as a kind of aspiration perhaps for individual soldiers. As a requirement for just war, it's not something that we can actually successfully do, frankly. And second, and this is related, I guess, to this first point, the idea of the relationship between character, emotion, and behaviour that underlies substantive conceptions of right intention is actually quite controversial. So there's been a lot of debate, which I'm not going to get into here, between social psychologists, philosophers, behavioural scientists about the relationship between character, if character even exists, and the effect of, for example, situations on human behaviour. So all that's to say that I don't think we want a conception of right intention that's based on a contested highly contested theory of character, emotion, and behaviour. In relation to right intention as an ad bellum criterion, I now think that perhaps it's essentially redundant in the sense that the practical work of right intention in terms of limiting war aims is really done by proportionality. So if the concern is that if a leader's war aims exceed just cause, then the war will also exceed the bounds of just cause. Well, in a sense, that concern is already addressed proportionality, because if the war aims exceed just cause, then they're also disproportionate. So if proportionality is met, just cause is met, and the other criteria that I'm not going to talk about are met, then I think the practical purpose of just war theory is achieved in restraining war to the achievement of just cause. So, and I mean, there's other concerns I have about even deciding who the right intention is supposed to apply to when you're talking about wars waged by complex organisations such as states. So that's maybe another reason to worry about right intention as an ad bellum. However, I do think right intention might still play a role as an in bello criterion. And I think, to sort of take a version of Steinhoff's view, if we think about right intention as in bello as requiring respect for the laws of armed conflict, which is a little bit different than Steinhoff's idea of respect for the justifying conditions of participation, then I think that might be an important new way of thinking about right intention. By respect for the laws of armed conflict, I don't mean something like a positive feeling towards or admiration for. I just mean a recognition that the laws have normative force that are binding on me, right? So it's, again, a fairly, there's a phrase for that kind of respect, but that's what I mean by respect. It means that you don't see the laws of war as just inconveniences that tie your hands and stop you doing what you need to do. That you don't see the laws of wars as just, a pain in the ass that's getting in your way, or that if you can get around them, you should. That would be not showing respect for the laws of armed conflict. So I take respect in this, very tentative sense as being, well, just, these are laws that have moral force, and that force applies to me. So understood in that way, I think proposing a kind of limited respect-based right intention would actually still serve the aim of limiting violations of human rights in war, and would do that in a way that we can more plausibly implement than the substantive conception of right intention. In a nutshell, I think it's easier to try and inculcate that kind of respect through military training and culture than it is to cultivate the emotions and character traits and virtues that a substantive right intention would require us to do. And I also think, though, it does share with the substantive right intention idea a respect, a recognition of the moral force of constraints on war, an appropriate regard for those constraints as well. So I think this understanding of right intention would be based on soldiers recognising the basis and force of the laws of war. Again, if we took this seriously, it would probably require greater resources during training and deployment to ensure that soldiers both understand the laws of war and why they're important and why they're binding on them. And so I do think, like substantive right intention views, my view would have implications requiring changes to military training and culture. But unlike the substantive conception, it's changes that I think would be relatively easy to implement and also are not based on contested theories of character and behaviour. Okay, so I'll leave that there and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, finally batting cleanup. I wanted to briefly comment on the venerable principle of double effect as pertains to collateral damage in war. And the principle first appears in Western thought in Aquinas' analysis of private self-defense and was later applied by Vittoria to collateral damage. Given the libraries of commentary on this issue, it would be almost impossible to say something new and correct. So I'll make 3 points with a sense of humility. This is somewhat experimental, and we'll see how it goes. First, a methodological assertion about virtue ethics. The definitive source of conclusions about the effects of our acts on character is experience. Through the years, the West has developed several concepts for analyzing these effects, including justification, permissibility, intention, and culpability. But it is important to highlight that these concepts were derived from experience and that their situational applicability is also derived from experience. It's also important to emphasize that the pertinent effects are not merely emotions, although negative emotions such as guilt, shame, indifference, and hate may accompany acts that are formative. As a Catholic, I'm especially fond of guilt. Instead, the decisive effects are not emotions, but they're the dispositions themselves. In the case of unjust acts, the most relevant effect is the disposition to give others their due. To put a very fine point on the issue at hand, then, we should know more about the dispositional effects of causing unintentional, certain, and proportionate collateral damage. So that's the first point. A second point. Even before collecting such evidence, the concepts themselves invite skepticism about this use of the principle. As mentioned earlier, Vittoria first argued for the permissibility of killing, quote, the innocent not by mistake, but with full knowledge of what one is doing, if this is an accidental effect, end quote. He continued, this is proven since it would otherwise be impossible to wage war against the guilty, thereby preventing the just side from fighting. Now, but by Vittoria's own standards, grounding permissibility in necessity for obtaining a just end is unacceptable. Means are not justified by just ends. So there must be something else going on, and that something else is contained in the word accidental, by which Vittoria means unintended. In stressing the significance of intentions, Vittoria is reaching back to Aquinas' treatment of private self-defense in the Summa. In another section of the Summa, Aquinas concluded that because a murderous aggressor forfeits their right to life, they may be intentionally killed by public authorities responsible for the common good if necessary for the community's defense. But Aquinas resorted to the principle of double effect when treating the permissibility of private self-defense. In such cases, the act of using lethal force is deemed permissible if the defender's intention is the defense of his life and the aggressor's death is an unintended side effect. So you all know this, I'm just rehashing. I believe this innovation was, or at least should have been, driven by the necessity requirement. Because even aggressors possess worth or dignity, their death must be necessary for defense and perhaps other ends associated with consequences and retributive conceptions of the purposes of punishment. For public authorities, complying with this requirement is relatively easy. They can rationally deliberate about whether capital punishment is necessary before intentionally killing. But circumstances of private self-defense preclude rational deliberation about necessity, and Aquinas thus argues that the aggressor's death must be unintended. Note that this unintended effect, in this case, is justifiable. The murderous aggressor receives his just deserts, and no excuse is required. A few centuries later, then, Vittoria similarly grounded a defensive act's permissibility in a justified intended effect. But collateral damage situations are unlike that of the private self-defender in a crucial detail. Because innocents retain their rights, the unintended effect is unjustified. However, the principle permits the act because one's character putatively is not damaged by unintended injustices. And we can talk about what I just said, those last two sentences. Now, some critics, such as John Ford in his 1944 critique of the morality of obliteration bombing, have countered by insisting that known unjust harms become an aspect of one's intention. But assuming that Ford is wrong, a conceptual problem may remain. Granted, one is not culpable for epistemically excused injustices. Such accidents are regrettable, but not blameworthy. On the other hand, one is culpable for effects that are known, whether they are intended or unintended. So this is an assertion which, I'll just make it. And in turn, one is formed by culpable acts. Character is therefore the product of both intentions and culpably caused effects. Finally, I would highlight that acts harmful to one's character might be considered impermissible. The ad bellum right intention criterion is based in part on this logic. For virtue ethics reasons, wrong intentions render war impermissible, even when all the other criteria are satisfied. So that's point two. So my third point returns to the first. I think more research needs to be done on the formative effects of causing collateral damage. My suspicion is that we would find something like the following. There are degrees of effects on one's dispositions, particularly on the virtue of justice. One's character is most damaged by targeting innocence. That's fairly obvious. Less damaged by the certain infliction of collateral damage, and unaffected by collateral harm that is purely accidental. For those inflicting certain collateral damage, the character effects would vary according to the frequency of such acts, their proportionality, and even if proportionate, the sheer numbers affected. So that's my thesis. And just to add, then, we had a workshop from Mike Skirker's forthcoming book yesterday, and one of the respondents, one of the discussants, was Whitley Kaufman. We were walking over to lunch, and I said, hey, I'm going to give a talk about the principle of double effect tomorrow. And he said, oh, I've written 2 books on that, defending it. So with trepidation, I look forward to your comments. Thanks. So, questions to anyone? Mark.
Jessica, I've read a lot about your question, especially on the use in bellow right intention question. And I think it's not a coincidence that the figures that you cite are Augustine and Aquinas, who are Christian writers. In some ways, I think what people said kind of got an apples and oranges problem in what here. They're interested in different problems than contemporary military training problems, it seems to me. I think as a practical matter, your conclusion is absolutely right. What we're interested in is the actual behavior. That's what you could train for, that's what you could regulate. But I think what Augustine and Aquinas are much more worried about is, frankly, the state of the soul of the individual.
Right, yeah.
And their state of salvation. And so, in the book I just published a couple years ago, I have one whole chapter called "Is a Just War Spirituality Possible?" in which I go through a bunch of war literature. People like Karl Marlantes, Carlos was now. You know his book, What It's Like to Go to War? The best war memoir I think ever written. Where he really broods a lot about the intentional state of the soldier and whether it's possible to have in combat the kind of mental states that theologians who've never been on the battlefield, like Augustine and Aquinas, talk about. And my conclusion is it's really not. It's not psychologically possible. So this is something you could write about as a theologian at great remove. And it's addressing an important question, the kind of question Jim was coming back to at the end about how do we deal with the effect of combat on a returning soldier. And the degree that we, in our culture, just ignore it and ignore their psychological and even spiritual state is a serious neglect of something very important that's going on. But it's a different question than what we do as a practical matter for training.
Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, in some reasons, I think one of the reasons why right intention has kind of dropped off the board a bit in terms of people's focus on contemporary just war theory is precisely because that original concern about how can you still have a good Christian soul yet fight in a war is not seen as pressing, at least not in terms of secular just war theory, obviously. I think your points about, where I think it's interesting, not just in terms of Christianity, but in general about soldiers' psychological and spiritual well-being. That I see as part of where I think that would be useful to talk about in terms of what is the military's duty to its own personnel. And I guess I don't see that as being a concern necessarily of the role of just war theory. I see it as a very important moral concern in relation to the military as a professional organisation with a duty of care to military personnel. And I think that's been extremely neglected. So I think there are plenty of other reasons for thinking about whether and to what extent military training and culture could be changed to enable soldiers to better deal emotionally, spiritually, psychologically with the experience of combat, given that I think you're absolutely right, that it's probably impossible to have the kind of mental state that Augustine and Aquinas would have seen as being the virtuous mental state in combat. And again, I think as a society, there's also a duty of care which is largely neglected in terms of soldiers transitioning back to civilian society. And just as a side note, it's always struck me as slightly odd, coming to America. I'm Australian, in case you didn't realise. But in Australia, veterans don't get discounts. There aren't, there really isn't the kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but there's an attitude towards veterans in America which seems at odds with the actual treatment of veterans in America. And that's very striking. It was very striking to me as a foreigner coming in, that there's this you know, people clap when veterans get on a plane, and there's veteran discounts, and there's a lot of sort of social, what's the word? Not propaganda, that's not what I mean.
All good?
But, sorry?
All good stuff?
Yeah, you know, but yeah, the treatment of veterans, at least from what I've heard anecdotally, is actually pretty bad in terms of the resources available to them. So that seems to be a weird dichotomy and sort of this weird feature of American treatment of their veterans. So I agree with what you said. I guess, I think I also agree with you that I don't think this is a concern of just War 3, but I think it's a neglected concern nonetheless.
Next. Bit.
Yeah, I'll stand way over here in the corner. We've talked a little bit about this, but I wanted to maybe open it up for our discussion. Your discussion of virtue and character, I think, is a sort of a generic one. But I think we also have to think about virtues in context. That is, people who occupy certain roles. And people in combat, for instance, have to cultivate certain virtues, and it seems to me double effect is a way of them morally reconciling, you know, what otherwise would be problematic according to ordinary morality. So it seems to me what I take you as suggesting is that this is true, but there inevitably is going to be some moral residue nonetheless, psychologically, like phenomenologically. And you know, my colleague Nancy Sherman has recently published a book called After War about the ways in which the returning soldiers deal with these sorts of things. So do I take you as making kind of a phenomenological or psychological point, or do you mean to mount more of a sort of direct challenge to double effect in that context?
Yeah. I would say both. I think that if there is a psychological and character effect, then that means that there's something possibly wrong with the way we've been using the concepts. And in the second part of my talk, I tried to suggest what might be going on. It's incorrect. My interest in this topic occurred because I was working in the Pentagon with a lot of Air Force officers, especially who fought in the first Gulf War. I was talking to a lot of them, and I had several situations that were almost like confessions. So we'd be out at a bar or hanging out, and somebody would just say, I want to talk to you about something, because I know you do ethics. And it was a long discussion about the fact that they didn't feel right about what they did in the first Gulf War. They dropped a lot of bombs, probably not a lot of collateral damage in that war, but some. And they felt that the experience didn't just affect them emotionally, psychologically, but it affected their character. They felt like it coarsened them. They felt that they, over time, transcended that, but they thought that they had this definite effect on their character for a time. So that's just the phenomenological, experiential. Those were the events that made me think a little bit more about this.
I guess the implication of that might be then you need to think carefully about entering this occupation to begin with.
Yeah, yes.
Where that leads you?
That's one implication. The other implication is that you may want to fight wars differently to avoid this as much as possible and think about using different services. This is probably a bigger problem with the Air Force that uses bombs, and then the ground services that use indirect fires. So you might want to think more about direct fires. You might want to think about different types of weapons that are less lethal in those situations where collateral damage is possible. So those would be two other implications. Oh no, Whitley.
Actually, my question, I thought you were very good. No, in fact, my question actually for Professor Luban.
Oh, okay.
Just your comments on, you talked about the post-World War II regime of force and the idea that's the only justification for initiating war was self-defense. But that's certainly not correct. That's for nations can't initiate force except for self-defense, but the Security Council can and has full rights to use preventive or punitive force. So I was wondering if you could address that, that if there's a need for preventive force when there's no direct temporally imminent threat, you're supposed to go to the Security Council and request authorization for them to use force, or for them to offer you to use force.
Yeah.
Well, I was thinking much more about unilateral use of force and not something that goes through the multilateral mechanism of the Security Council. I'm not sure that I would sign on to the idea that if the UN says that it's okay to use military force to forestall some distant threat to peace, that it doesn't raise exactly the same moral issues that I'm worried about. And I don't think that the Charter has been interpreted that way. For instance, take the recent discussion of the responsibility to protect, the so-called R2P idea that was endorsed by the World Outcomes Summit and embedded in Security Council resolutions, and actually invoked in the Libya conflict. The Secretary General issued a statement about what R2P means, the responsibility to protect against war crimes and crimes against humanity and genocide. And he emphasizes that what the kind of preemptive, ex-ante actions should, in the first instance, not be military. Capacity building, brokering of peace. And I think that whatever the framers of the UN Charter meant by saying that the UN could use force, time has really changed that. It's blunted it. I mean, I think the first sign that that was true was that at that point, there's this real sense that the states would contribute troops to a UN army. Well, nobody was willing to do that. Really, we're going to put our troops under the command of a general who is from another country. So that became dead letter very quickly. And it seems to me that right now, the idea of preventive force being used by the Security Council is really only an idea on paper.
Okay. Adam over there.
So my question was in part for you, Ed, and then maybe just you might say something about this. So Ed, you said a few times something along the lines of one's character may be harmed by targeting innocent people or these sort of things. And you answered part of this, I guess, to Nick's question before, but I wanted a bit of clarification, and then there's a question to follow up, which was when you said one's character can be harmed, do you mean something like moral injury or causing some moral dissonance? So I think innocent people should be killed, or I've had to kill innocent people, how do I deal with that? Or do you think, or did you mean that one's character can be harmed as in this now creates you as a bad person? I no longer care about innocent people, and it's not something that I should care about. And depending on the answer to that, how then should that, or how do you see that coming into teaching military efforts to people who are going to face these sorts of issues?
Right. Yeah. No, I think I'm taking the latter tack. That this is changing their character and making them possibly less solicitous of the value of other human beings, and therefore less just, would be the specific virtue which I think is endangered here. How to teach this, though? That this is a fairly radical change. Although students, when I teach the basic, the core ethics course, have a real problem. It's a difficult concept, the principle of double effect, but they don't quite buy into it. And so I'm wondering whether or not we're teaching it the way it should be taught. Maybe we should rethink, just rethink our use of the concepts. The concepts I think are correct. I'm just not sure if we're using them correctly. So I'm dancing around obviously a little bit here, but I think we might want to reevaluate the way that we teach the principle of double effect. Yeah.
Could I please pose a thought and a question to you, just following up on that. The thought is this: it seems to me that the big worry that you're raising is the use of the principle of double effect as a kind of magic wand that makes moral responsibility for collateral damage disappear so thoroughly that it's as if it never happened, and that using it that way just kind of makes us feel too unguilty. I think that the principle works to stop somebody who is waging war from feeling too guilty about the fact that inevitably there is collateral damage when war is waged. And you know, when you're thinking about how to train, you know, how to teach character, you know, how to train character, then you're looking for some kind of a medium between feeling too guilty, you know, disabling guilty, the way that a surgeon would feel if the surgeon had to take all of the collateral pain that she inflicts with her scalpel onto herself, and feeling too unguilty, like, well, it was proportionate, so all those dead bodies, they just go away, who cares? And that would really be a terrible kind of character to have. It just doesn't matter. So so that's my thought, is that you're looking for the medium between too innocent or too unguilty and too guilty. And the question is that what you think the training should be trying to inculcate, and therefore that we should talk less about double effect as if it's just the magic wand that makes blameworthiness go away?
I would say tentatively, preliminarily, yes. I think we should teach them that what's done with certainty, even though it's unintended, is they're culpable for it, and they should feel guilty about it, and it's a problem. It's a moral problem. Ultimately, my prescription would be to not assuage the guilt, to actually kind of fess up to it, because there's a problem here. I don't think the effect is the same as intentionally harming a civilian, but I think that the effect on character and then associated with that perhaps guilt is not zero, and we've been teaching it as if it's zero, and I think that's possibly a problem. Reed?
So this would be for you, Ed, or maybe anyone on the panel. Aside from prevention or preemption, I wonder if there's been any discussion of an ethic of preparedness. I think that part of the reason why the kill and beyond sort of quasi-pacifism comes in for criticism is it gets blamed for the lack of preparedness on the part of democratic nations when it came to leading up to World War II. And I would also say on some of the issues you were talking about soldiers, there is an obligation on the military profession to be extremely realistic about what war is like going into this thing. This is not going to be fun. It's going to wound you in ways that will probably stay with you forever. And if you're not down with that, as young people say, then going for dentistry or something like that. This is an obligation on us. Any discussion of that in your group, Ed, or anybody else want to respond to that?
Well, certainly, the preparedness question is something I've not thought about, but I'd like to talk a little bit about your second point about realism in preparing soldiers for the reality of war. I mean, certainly that one of my general concerns, and I have a research interest in war crimes and how war crimes come to be rationalized and justified, and it seems that one of the concerns might be that we might think some of the ways in which character is taught in the military are not sensitive to the realities of the effect of combat on people's behaviour and emotions and beliefs and attitudes. And so we have sort of training which is about here's how you be a good, here's how to be a good officer, but then you have what actually happens when you're in the field and the effects of situational forces, group conformity, all kinds of other features of combat. If there's too much of a disconnect between those, then any theory of character that you're using in military training is just not going to get any grip in terms of actually helping soldiers deal with real combat in a way which can allow them to at least maintain some kind of integrity, and also might in a practical sense minimise the likelihood of violations of laws about conflict. So I think your point's a really good one. I think there is a problem perhaps in military ethics in general. Certainly I think there's a bit of an issue in military training, but sort of the focus on character is that it hasn't been sufficiently sensitive to the realities of combat.
One last question. Who feels very strongly? Did you?
First, just a comment. I think it's important to keep right intention on the table. I note, for example, that if we didn't have right intention there, we wouldn't have any way of doing the kind of thing you're talking about doing in assessing whether to use preemptive force or not. But more particularly on the matter of double effect. Ed, I used to argue with Paul Ramsey, taking basically the position you took, that knowledge of the results means you've got guilt there. And his response was always, no, that's proportionality. It's really a matter of proportionality, figuring out whether the proportions are right to allow you to do it so as the guilt is greater or lesser. I'm not convinced entirely of that. But I am convinced of the importance of keeping something like double effect also in the mix. I was remembering a breakout session at another conference here at the Naval Academy some years ago. The subject was collateral damage, and I was just sitting in. I had given a talk, and I was just sitting in, and this heated debate developed among four participants in the conference. One of them was a Marine colonel, infantry type. One was a Navy commander, sort of great staff all the way. Another was a former, another naval commander, a former nuclear submarine commander, and another was an Air Force colonel who had been a squadron, B-52 squadron commander. And the first two guys were basically saying, we don't need anything like double effect because you've got a mission, you've got the enemy, go in and do your job, and don't worry about the collaterals. But then these other two guys just jumped all over them. The people who had actually had the responsibility for the use of nuclear weapons in war, and extraordinarily strongly defended the idea of double effect. My concern is that if we take double effect off the table, the only real option is the option to say, well, the enemy is the enemy, and they're all our enemies. And that puts us in a different ballgame.
Or you have just a lesser evil defense. I haven't figured this out completely, but what I want to say is that you're permitted to do the act, but you're still culpable for the injustice, and therefore it's going to affect you. So I kind of want it both ways, and I'm not sure I can get it, but that's what I want to think about a little bit more.
Yeah, I know there's other questions and comments, and we can probably handle those at lunch. Make sure you're at the same table as the people you'd like to debate with. But we're actually not going to do lunch yet. We're going to take a break until 11:30, and then we have a keynote speaker, and then lunch. You'll start smelling the lunch, but this is part of character development, of self-discipline and all those kinds of things. But we are going to have a speaker and then lunch, but we're going to take a break till 11:30. And again, we'll reconvene, and Ed's going to introduce our speaker. So thank you to the panel. I'm going to give them their gifts as you all go on your break, but we very much appreciate the thought you've put into this and the year you've spent tackling this issue. So thank you.